The call sign came over the radio at 0312 local time in Afghanistan, which was 1342 at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, where I was sitting in a ground control station the size of a shipping container, flying an MQ-9 Reaper at 14,000 feet over Helmand Province. The call sign was Bravo 39er. That was my uncle's convoy. I had been watching it for 47 minutes, which meant I had watched every vehicle in that convoy, every formation adjustment, every route deviation around a suspicious pile of road debris that the lead truck spotted and avoided 2 kilometers back. I had been watching from a camera capable of reading a license plate from 2 miles up, through terrain that hid everything from ground level and revealed everything from the air, with patience that a manned aircraft cannot sustain because manned aircraft run out of fuel in hours, and I had been on station since before dawn in Afghanistan, which was the previous evening in Nevada, because the MQ-9 can loiter for 27 hours, and my sensor operator and I could rotate in ways a cockpit crew cannot. Then the mortar fire started. 3 rounds in 40 seconds. The thermal signature of the launch position visible on my sensor display before the rounds even impacted. I had the firing coordinates locked within 12 seconds of the first round. The decision to engage took 41 seconds of controlled procedures, authorization confirmation, positive identification, and weapons release. The mortar team was neutralized before they could fire a 5th round. Bravo 39er reported no casualties. 4 months later, my uncle called drone pilots cowards in front of the entire extended family at Thanksgiving. He didn't know I had been flying overwatch on his convoy. He still doesn't know that part. This is the part where I tell the rest. My name is Captain Jennifer Yates. I am a United States Air Force RPA pilot, which stands for Remotely Piloted Aircraft, the official term for what most people call drones. I fly the MQ-9 Reaper from a ground control station at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada. My aircraft is in the sky over a combat zone. I am not. This is the fact that generates the coward accusation, the video game accusation, the range of dismissals that suggest that because I am not physically present in the airspace I am operating in, I am not in combat. My work does not carry weight, my risk is not real, and my contribution to the wars my family's military members have fought in is lesser than the contributions of the people who are physically there. My uncle, Master Sergeant David Yates, retired Army infantry, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, held this view explicitly and expressed it whenever the topic of drone warfare came up, which at family gatherings was more often than you might expect when half the people at the table had served or were serving. He held the view sincerely. He was not performing for the audience. He genuinely believed that remote warfare was a diminishment of the military profession, that the psychological and physical separation between the pilot and the weapons effect represented something worth objecting to on principle. I understood his argument. I disagreed with it completely. And I documented every version of the conversation, every holiday dinner comment, every time he described my career as video gaming in uniform. Because I document everything, and because I understood that someday the documentation would be relevant in a way I couldn't fully predict from where I was sitting. The first comment came 18 months into my RPA career, at Christmas. I had just completed my initial qualification on the MQ-9 and was 3 months into my first operational assignment. 15 missions flown. 7 of them strike missions with weapons employed, real weapons, real effects, real decisions with real consequences made by me from a room in Nevada. My uncle asked what I was flying. I told him. He nodded with the measured patience of a man who was deciding how honest to be. The video game jets, he said. Not to be cruel. That was his actual understanding of what I did. Video game jets. I explained that the MQ-9 was a 27-hour endurance platform with a sophisticated sensor suite and precision-guided munitions, and that I was making lethal decisions on real targets affecting real people. He nodded again, with the same patience. Still not the same? He said. You go home at the end of the shift. He was right that I went home at the end of the shift. He was wrong that this was the relevant distinction. I wrote it down. Date, location, exact words. The notation I made beside it was a question. What does he think a sensor picture looks like from 14,000 feet when a vehicle runs over an IED? What does he think the pilot sees? I did not ask him the question out loud. I kept it in the notebook. The second comment came 8 months later. I had been promoted to first lieutenant and had 64 missions behind me. 2 months prior, I had been the pilot on a close air support mission in support of a special operations team in contact. Enemy forces in an occupied compound. Friendly forces taking fire. 18 minutes between the request for air support and my weapons release. 2 missiles employed, threat neutralized, 0 friendly casualties. The kind of mission that gets described in official commendations with language about precision and timeliness and tactical outcome. My uncle was at Thanksgiving. Someone mentioned that I had been commended for a recent mission. He asked what kind of mission. I said close air support, which is the military term for air-delivered firepower in direct support of ground forces in contact with the enemy. He was quiet for a moment. From Nevada, he said. Not a question. An observation that functioned as a dismissal. From Nevada, I confirmed. He moved to another conversation. I noted it. 64 missions, 1 commendation, and the dismissal was still from Nevada, as if the physical location of the person operating the weapons was the morally and professionally relevant variable. I went back to Creech after the holiday and flew 3 more missions that week, including one 22-hour surveillance mission in support of a hostage rescue operation that ultimately succeeded in part because of the pattern of life intelligence my sensor operator and I had been building on the target compound for 11 days. Nobody at Thanksgiving would ever know about that mission. Nobody outside a classified debrief room needed to know, but I knew, and I wrote it down, and I kept flying. The Thanksgiving that mattered happened 4 months after the Convoy incident. My uncle had been home for 2 weeks. He was healthy. His convoy had taken mortar fire and had no casualties and had continued its mission, and he had completed his deployment and come home. He knew that air support had neutralized the mortar team. He had been briefed that an MQ-9 had been on station. He did not know the pilot's name. He did not know the pilot was his niece. He sat at the same table he always sat at, and he said, between the stuffing and the pie, that he respected the technology, but that the people operating it were technicians rather than warriors, that the term pilot was a courtesy extended to people who had never faced the possibility of being shot down, that war required presence, and presence required courage, and remote warfare, by definition, removed presence from the equation and therefore removed the courage requirement, and he was not sure that was good for the profession. He said this clearly and without particular aggression, the way a person states a position they have held for a long time and considered carefully. Several people at the table nodded. My mother looked at me. I looked at my plate. I added the entry to the notebook that evening when I got home. I wrote down every word he said. I wrote down the date and the time and the fact that 4 months earlier, I had been the RPA crew that neutralized the mortar team targeting his convoy, and that this was not information I had shared and was not information I planned to share on that particular evening. Not because I was protecting him, because the time had not come yet. The work was not finished. The record was not complete enough. You do not present partial evidence. You wait until the full picture is available and then you let it do its work. Let me tell you what flying an MQ-9 actually requires, because the video game framework depends on a misunderstanding so complete that correcting it requires starting from the beginning. The MQ-9 Reaper is a 27-hour endurance remotely piloted aircraft with a wingspan of 66 feet, a service ceiling of 50,000 feet, and a weapons payload that includes AGM-114 Hellfire missiles and GBU-12 laser-guided bombs. It is controlled from a ground control station via satellite data link with a latency of approximately 1.2 seconds, which means every input I make reaches the aircraft 1.2 seconds after I make it, and every sensor reading I receive is 1.2 seconds old. That latency is a constant variable in every decision I make. Managing it is a skill. It took me 400 simulator hours and an additional 200 actual flight hours before I managed it without thinking about it, which is the point at which a skill becomes reliable under pressure. I operate in a crew of 2, myself as pilot, responsible for aircraft control and weapons employment, and my sensor operator, responsible for managing the aircraft's camera systems, tracking targets, and maintaining the situational awareness that the pilot cannot maintain alone while flying the aircraft. Together we are two people doing the work that requires, in a manned aircraft, a pilot and a weapons systems officer, and a situational awareness that the cockpit environment partially provides because you can look out the window. I cannot look out the window. Everything I know about my aircraft's environment comes through sensors. Managing sensor-derived situational awareness in 3 dimensions, at altitude, across a combat environment with moving friendly forces and moving threat forces and terrain that hides things and weather that degrades the sensor picture, is not a video game skill. It is a professional skill that takes years to develop and that fails under pressure if it has not been developed through the specific kind of repetition that builds real competence. The psychological dimension of RPA operations is also not what my uncle imagined. He believed that physical separation from the aircraft meant emotional separation from the weapon's effects. He was wrong. When I employ a weapon, I watch the effect through the sensor. Not from altitude. Not from distance that blurs the image into abstraction. Through a high-definition electro-optical camera that can resolve individual figures at the range I'm operating at, with a thermal channel that shows heat signatures through darkness and smoke, with a sensor operator tracking the image while I manage the aircraft so that neither of us looks away from what is happening. I watch everything. I have watched things that required me to close the debrief with my unit's flight surgeon, which is the Air Force's version of acknowledging that what you saw required professional processing before you could process it on your own. I have gone home at the end of shifts, when going home meant driving 20 minutes in Nevada traffic to a house where my family was having dinner and the television was on, and sat at that dinner table with the specific burden of a person who has seen things that the people passing the bread have not seen and cannot understand and would not benefit from being told about. That is not the absence of cost. That is a different kind of cost. A cost that does not look like the cost my uncle paid and does not generate the same recognition, but is real and accumulates over years of operational flying in a way that the Air Force is still learning to address adequately. The mission on the night of Bravo 39er began at 0055 local time, 9 hours before the Mortar attack. My sensor operator, Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb, and I had been tasked with route survey and convoy overwatch for a logistics movement through southern Helmand. Standard assignment. We had flown this type of mission 47 times together. We knew each other's working patterns well enough to communicate in the abbreviated shorthand that experienced crews develop. The single words and head movements that replace sentences when the pace of operations requires speed over completeness. Webb was technically gifted in ways I was not. His sensor management was exceptional. His ability to read thermal imagery and identify anomalies in terrain that looked uniform to less experienced eyes was the kind of skill that briefings describe as experienced sensor operator, and that translates in practice to catching things that would otherwise be missed. I trusted his reads. He trusted my aircraft management. We were good together. The convoy was 12 vehicles. Fuel trucks, supply vehicles, a security element of 4 armored vehicles at intervals through the column. They had departed their forward operating base at 23:47 the previous evening and were approximately 6 hours into a 10-hour movement when we took over overwatch from the previous RPA crew at 0055. The handoff briefing identified 2 areas of interest along the remaining route, a valley crossing that had seen IED activity in the previous 30 days, and a ridgeline that provided good firing positions for any element wanting to engage the convoy from altitude. Standard concerns for this type of movement in this region. We noted them and began our pattern. For 47 minutes nothing happened except the careful, grinding, unglamorous work of surveillance. The convoy moved. We watched. Webb adjusted the sensor to maintain coverage. I adjusted the aircraft's orbit to keep the sensor pointed where it needed to be. No anomalies, no thermal signatures that indicated human presence in positions of concern. The valley crossing was clean. The IED suspicious area cleared without incident. I was 4 hours from end of mission when the thermal picture changed. The firing position was on the ridgeline I had noted in the handoff briefing. 2 individuals, prone, with a weapon system that Webb identified in 3.2 seconds as a mortar baseplate and tube. Hostile ridge, bearing 270 from Convoy lead, he said. Not excitement in his voice. The specific flat focus of a sensor operator who has been in this situation before and knows what the next 90 seconds require. I was already adjusting the aircraft. Confirm identification. 2 individuals, mortar system, baseplate set, tube elevated approximately 45 degrees. They're preparing to fire. They fired before I could get weapons authorization. The first round went long, the second adjusted. The third was close enough to the third vehicle in the convoy that the truck's heat signature on the thermal camera shifted laterally, a sudden movement that meant the driver had reacted, which meant the driver was still alive. Bravo 39er, be advised, you have a mortar firing position at bearing 270, distance approximately 800 meters ridge, 2 enemy personnel, confirmed hostile act. We are requesting authorization to engage. Break. Battle Watch, this is Phantom 2-1, requesting weapons release authorization, time-sensitive target. The Battle Watch controller's response took 19 seconds. 19 seconds during which I had the firing coordinates locked, the Hellfire programmed, and Webb maintaining positive identification of 2 individuals who were preparing a 4th round. Phantom 2-1, Battle Watch, authorization granted. Confirm positive ID of hostile personnel. Confirm no collateral damage concerns. Battle Watch, positive ID confirmed. 2 hostile personnel with mortar system, actively engaging friendly convoy. No civilian presence in target area. Collateral damage assessment complete. Phantom 2-1, you are cleared to engage. 22 seconds from authorization request to clearance. I released the first Hellfire at 0314 hours and 12 seconds. Time of flight to target was 8 seconds. Webb called the impact. Firing position neutralized. I tasked Webb to conduct a post-strike assessment while I monitored the convoy. Bravo 39er reported no casualties. The entire engagement, from initial threat identification to weapons impact, took 41 seconds. 41 seconds in which I made approximately 30 distinct operational decisions. Aircraft positioning, sensor tasking, threat identification, radio procedures, weapons programming, authorization request, target confirmation, collateral damage assessment, weapons release. 30 decisions in 41 seconds, each one with consequences that were real and immediate, and that I will carry in my operational record and in my memory for the rest of my career. When my uncle said drone pilots were technicians rather than warriors, this was the moment he was characterizing as video gaming. This was the no courage required operation. 30 decisions in 41 seconds while a convoy took mortar fire, and I was the only asset in position to stop it. I note this not to claim a courage I am reluctant to claim for myself. I note it because the characterization was wrong and the wrongness had a cost, and the cost was borne by every RPA crew member who heard those characterizations and continued doing the work anyway, while the people doing the characterizing went to the same family dinners and accepted the same thanks for their service that they refused to extend to ours. I told my uncle 8 months after that Thanksgiving. Not on a holiday. Not with an audience. I drove to his house on a Tuesday afternoon when I had a day off from a training rotation, and I sat at his kitchen table, and I told him that 4 months before the Thanksgiving where he made the warrior speech, I had been the RPA crew on station over his convoy when the mortar attack happened. I watched his face go through 3 distinct phases. The first was confusion, the expression of a person trying to place new information in an existing framework and finding the fit difficult. The second was something I hadn't seen from him before, a specific stillness that wasn't neutrality, but the absence of the defensiveness that usually accompanied any challenge to his positions. The third was recognition, the slow arrival of a person at an understanding they have been resisting. You were on that mission, he said. I was the pilot on that mission. You saw the convoy. I had been watching your convoy for 47 minutes before the mortar fire started. I had the firing position identified in 12 seconds. Authorization took 41 seconds total from first round to weapons release. He was quiet for a long time. not performing quiet, actually sitting with information that had not yet found its place. "You didn't tell me," he said. "No." "Why not?" "Because you were in the middle of a deployment and coming home was more important than scoring a point, and because I wanted the full picture before I said anything." "What's the full picture?" "You've called my career a video game and drone pilots cowards and warriors without courage in front of me, in front of our family, on at least 7 documented occasions over 3 years. I have the dates and locations and exact words. I kept them because I document everything and because I believed eventually they would be relevant." He absorbed that. 7 times, he said. "At least. And you never said anything." "No. Because the argument in the abstract never resolves. It resolves like this, with a specific mission and a specific timeline, and the facts of what I was doing and what I saw and what I decided while your convoy was taking fire. That's the resolution I was waiting for." He didn't apologize immediately. That was not his style, and I did not want his style to change on my behalf. He sat with it for several minutes, which I respected because it suggested he was processing it genuinely rather than performing a response. Then he said, "Tell me what you actually see in a mission." "The sensor picture." So I told him. Not classified specifics. The experience of it. The thermal imagery, what it looks like when a vehicle runs over an IED from 14,000 feet. What human figures look like on the infrared sensor in the dark. What a mortar launch signature looks like when it fires, and what the blast pattern looks like on post-strike assessment, and what the pilot sees through the sensor in the seconds after a weapon's impact. I told him about the flight surgeon briefings, about going home to dinner after missions that had produced effects I had watched through a high-definition camera, about the latency, the 1.2-second delay between input and response, and what managing that latency under pressure required and how long it took to develop that management to the point of reliability. He listened with the specific attention of a person who was revising something significant. Not just a position on drone warfare. Something about me. Something about what he had been seeing when he looked at his niece for the past 3 years and what he was seeing now. "You've been doing this the whole time," he said, while I was making the video game comments. "Yes. And you kept the record. 7 documented conversations." He was quiet again. Then, "What do you want from me?" "Nothing specific. I wanted you to know what actually happened on April 22nd. And I wanted to tell you face to face, rather than at Thanksgiving with an audience, because this isn't about the audience." He nodded slowly. "That's generous." "It's accurate," I said. "The audience doesn't change what's true." He did tell people, not at Thanksgiving, which I had specifically not wanted. He told people the way people tell things when they mean it, one conversation at a time. His squadron of retired infantry colleagues gathered at a monthly dinner. His son, my cousin, who was considering whether to enlist and had mentioned drone operations as a possibility and had heard the video game characterization from his father and filed it away. His son called me 2 weeks after the conversation. "Dad told me what happened with the convoy," he said. "He said I should call you before I decided anything about my career." I spent 40 minutes on the phone with my cousin explaining RPA operations, the qualification pipeline, the operational role, the psychological landscape of remote warfare, the specific ways it differed from what most people imagined, and the specific ways it was exactly as hard as any other combat aviation. He enlisted 8 months later. He is currently in the Air Force qualification pipeline for RPA operations. He will be a better crew member than I was at his stage because he will arrive knowing what the work actually involves, rather than having to unlearn a framework that was wrong from the beginning. The notebook is full now. Not just the grievance entries, the 7 documented conversations with my uncle, the operational log I keep alongside them, missions flown, targets engaged, convoys protected, including one on April 22nd in Helmand Province that had 12 vehicles and no casualties, partly because I had been watching it for 47 minutes before anyone fired at it. All of it in the same notebook, the dismissals alongside the work, because they belonged together. Because understanding the dismissal requires understanding what was being dismissed. My uncle spent 3 years characterizing my career while I was accumulating missions and making decisions and watching things through a sensor that the people making the characterizations never had to watch. The notebook holds both: the dismissal and the work, the coward comment and the 41 seconds. All of it in the same handwriting, all of it equally precise, all of it waiting for the conversation that gave it context. I am still flying, still at Creech, still accumulating missions in a notebook that is now on its 3rd volume, still going home after shifts and sitting at dinner tables and carrying what I carry. The Air Force has gotten better in recent years at acknowledging the psychological cost of RPA operations, at providing support structures for crews who are doing work that civilian frameworks struggle to categorize correctly. We are not the people who were never there. We were there through the sensor, for hours longer than any manned aircraft could stay, watching with a persistence and resolution that changed what was survivable on the ground in ways that will take decades to fully document. The convoys that completed their movements, the special operations teams that came back, the mortar teams that fired 1 round instead of 10 because we were on station, and we saw them, and we acted. That is the record. That is what the notebook holds. If you are doing work that someone you love does not understand and has dismissed in ways that cost you something, I want to offer you the specific encouragement that comes from this particular experience. Document it, not out of spite, out of respect for the work and for yourself. Keep the accurate record of what you do and why it matters and what it costs and what it produces. Keep it alongside the dismissals, in the same notebook, so that the full picture is always available when the moment arrives that requires it. The moment will arrive. It may require something dramatic, a specific mission and a specific timeline and a face-to-face conversation on a Tuesday afternoon. Or it may arrive more quietly, in a phone call from a cousin who is deciding what to do with his life and has questions. Either way, the record matters. The record is the thing that makes the conversation honest. My uncle called drone pilots cowards for 3 years. Then he found out that the coward he'd been talking about had been watching his convoy in the dark from Nevada and had taken out the mortar team before the 4th round fell. He hasn't made the comment since. His son is in the RPA pipeline. The record held. It always does, eventually. You just have to keep writing it down. Have you ever done work that the people around you dismissed until the moment it saved them? Drop a comment below. We tell stories like this every week, about the invisible work, and the patient documentation, and the day the record finally speaks. Subscribe and stay with us, because the work was always real. It just needed the right moment to be seen. Let me tell you about the training pipeline, because the dismissal depends on the assumption that becoming an RPA pilot is easier than becoming a traditional pilot, and that assumption is wrong in ways that matter. I spent 14 months in initial flight training before I ever touched an MQ-9 simulator. 14 months of traditional aviation training, the same primary and instrument and multi-engine progression that any Air Force pilot completes, culminating in my wings. The Air Force does not shortcut flight training for RPA pilots. We learn to fly because flying is the foundation, because understanding what the aircraft is doing and why it is doing it requires the same aeronautical knowledge whether the pilot is in the cockpit or in a ground control station in Nevada. After wings, I entered the formal MQ-9 qualification course, which added 4 months of platform-specific training covering the sensor suite, the weapon systems, the communications architecture, the rules of engagement framework that governs every decision about when to engage and when to hold, and the crew resource management that makes a 2-person team function correctly when the pace of operations requires both members to operate at the edge of their individual capacity. From initial application to first operational mission, 22 months. During that 22 months, I accumulated more flight hours than most single-engine general aviation pilots accumulate in a decade. The video game framework imagines someone picking up a controller and beginning to play. The reality is a professional qualification pipeline that is long and demanding, and that produces pilots who understand exactly what they are doing and why and what happens when they stop doing it correctly. My first weapons employment was on day 4 of my operational assignment. My commander had decided to put me on a permissive close air support tasking where the target was confirmed and the authorization process was expected to be routine, a relatively low-complexity first employment to build the muscle memory before the higher complexity situations arrived. My sensor operator that day was Staff Sergeant Reeves, a veteran of 4 previous tours who had been through enough first employments with enough new pilots to have a calibrated read on how they went. The target was a weapons cache in a building that had been under surveillance for 9 days. No civilian presence confirmed over the surveillance period. Weapons release clearance was granted after a standard authorization process. I employed 1 GBU-12. Reeves called the impact. Target destroyed. Reeves looked at me afterward and said, "How are you doing?" Not "how did that go?" "How are you doing?" Because he had been through enough of these to know that the first employment lands differently than any training run, that watching the real effect through the sensor is qualitatively different from watching the simulation, and that new pilots needed to be checked, not celebrated. I told him I was fine. I was not entirely fine. I processed it appropriately with the flight surgeon at my next required check-in, and I filed it in the mental compartment where I filed the things that needed to be carried rather than resolved. Then I went back and flew the next mission. That is what professional military aviation requires: the ability to carry what you carry without letting it distort the decisions you need to make. RPA pilots carry this the same way any combat aviation crew carries it. We just carry it in a ground control station in Nevada instead of in a cockpit over the target, and we carry it home to dinner tables that have no idea what just arrived. The surveillance dimension of RPA operations is what my uncle understood least and what I spent the most time trying to explain when I finally told him about the Convoy. The persistent surveillance capability of the MQ-9, the ability to maintain continuous sensor coverage of a target area for 20 hours or more, produces a kind of operational knowledge that is qualitatively different from what a manned aircraft can generate. A fighter making a strike pass sees the target for seconds. I see the target for hours. I watch the pattern of life, the routines that reveal what the compound is actually used for, who comes and goes, and at what times and why the vehicle traffic follows a specific pattern that indicates something is being planned. Pattern of life analysis is the intelligence product that underwrites the most consequential targeting decisions the military makes, and it is generated by RPA crews who are watching for hours and building a picture that no other collection platform can build with equivalent persistence. On the Bravo 39er Convoy mission, those 47 minutes of pre-attack surveillance had already produced a threat picture that I was using to adjust the convoy's risk assessment in real time. The ridgeline concern from the handoff brief was already elevated in my assessment, because Webb had seen movement there 18 minutes before the mortar fire. 18 minutes I had spent watching a position that turned out to be the firing point. 18 minutes that meant I had the thermal signature baseline for that ridgeline already established, which is why the change was visible in the 12 seconds between the first mortar round and my target lock. Without 47 minutes of patient surveillance, the mortar team might have fired 6 rounds before I had positive identification. 6 rounds on a convoy of 12 vehicles is a different calculation than 3 rounds on a convoy that took no casualties. The surveillance is what made the engagement decision precise rather than approximate. And the surveillance is the part that the video game framework cannot accommodate because it does not fit the action movie template of combat aviation. Webb deserves his own section in this account because Webb was the other half of every good decision I made on April 22nd and on the 112 other missions we flew together over 3.5 years. Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb was from Biloxi, Mississippi, had been flying sensors for 7 years, had 3 operational deployments worth of experience in his reading of thermal imagery, and had a quality that I came to think of as professional stillness, the ability to work at full intensity without any visible change in his presentation. In tense situations, he did not become more animated, he became more precise. His communication shortened to exactly the information required and nothing else. No filler, no excess. the verbal efficiency of a person whose training had compressed everything unnecessary out of what remained in high-stress moments. On the night of the convoy mission, from the moment he identified the mortar system to the moment he called the impact, his voice did not change register once. Not elevation, not acceleration, not the slight tightening that you hear in most people when the situation requires a decision that will have permanent consequences. He was the same at the end of those 41 seconds as he was at the beginning. That stillness was communicable. It is part of why I was the same. Two people in a ground control station, 3 continents away from the target, watching through a sensor and making decisions in 41 seconds that were precise because both of us had been trained to be precise under exactly this kind of pressure. Webb told me after the debrief that it was a clean engagement. He said it the way he said everything, without performance or decoration. Clean engagement. That was the highest professional compliment available in the vocabulary we used. I wrote it down. It is in the notebook beside the entry about my uncle's Thanksgiving comments. The same notebook, the same handwriting, clean engagement and coward pilot in the same volume of the same record, which is the right place for both of them. 6 months after my conversation with my uncle, I received a written statement from a ground soldier who had been in a convoy I provided overwatch for during an earlier deployment. He had tracked me down through his unit's after-action reports and my name in a commendation file. He wrote 2 pages. He described a mission where enemy forces had set up an ambush position on a route his unit was using, and where the RPA crew on station had identified the ambush position and communicated it to the ground force in time to redirect the convoy before it entered the kill zone. He did not describe a weapons employment. He described a 20-minute surveillance pattern that identified a threat that the ground element could not see from their position, and a clear communication that allowed them to make a different decision than the one that would have cost them casualties. He wrote, "I don't know who was flying that day, but I know that whoever it was watching more carefully than anything else in that sky, and saw what we couldn't see and told us in time. I went home because of that. I want whoever did that to know that someone on the ground understands what they actually do." I forwarded a copy of that letter to my uncle, not as evidence in an ongoing argument, as a data point, as the perspective of the person on the ground who was the actual beneficiary of the work we do. My uncle read it. He called me that evening. He did not say much. He said the letter was important and that he was glad I had sent it. I noted the call in the notebook. Not with satisfaction, because the goal was never satisfaction. With the specific acknowledgement that the record was continuing to be written, and that the full picture was continuing to develop, and that somewhere in the chain of conversations and missions and documented dismissals and documented work, there was a real change happening, not just in my uncle's stated position, but in the network of people his position influenced. That is the actual goal. Not to win an argument. To change what a network of people understands. One conversation, one letter, one phone call, one cousin in the qualification pipeline at a time. The work is the answer. The work is always the answer. You just have to keep doing it and keep writing it down. The coward accusation specifically deserves a direct response, because it was the word my uncle used, and it is the word that carries the most weight in the military culture where I grew up and in which I have served. Cowardice in military context means the failure of courage in the face of danger. It is the refusal to act when action is required and dangerous. It is the worst thing you can say about a person in uniform because it goes to the core of what the profession requires and what the profession values. My uncle used it not to describe a specific failure of mine, but as a structural critique. That remote warfare removes danger from the equation and therefore removes the need for courage, and therefore the people who wage it are by definition not demonstrating the professional virtue that combat requires. This is a philosophical argument, not a personal insult, and I took it as such. But it was wrong in a way worth being specific about. The danger profile of RPA operations is different from the danger profile of manned aviation, but it is not zero. RPA ground control stations have been targeted by adversary cyber and electronic warfare operations specifically because the satellite links that connect the pilot to the aircraft are a vulnerability worth attacking. The aircraft themselves operate in environments where they can be engaged by surface-to-air missiles. Losing an aircraft for an RPA crew means losing a weapon system whose loss ends the mission and whose kinetic energy on impact may kill people on the ground. The responsibility of ensuring that does not happen falls on the crew in the ground control station. This is a different kind of risk than being in the cockpit, but it is not no risk. Beyond the physical risk dimension, the argument for no courage required fails on the more important ground of the decisions themselves. Courage in warfare is not exclusively about accepting danger. It is about making difficult decisions with consequences you must live with under pressure, with incomplete information in real time. That is what combat aviation requires. That is what RPA operations require. The difficulty of the decision, the weight of what is at stake, the impossibility of perfect information, the necessity of acting anyway and being accountable for the outcome, none of that is removed by the physical distance between the pilot and the aircraft. If anything, the sensor clarity that the MQ-9 provides means I see the consequences of my decisions with a resolution that many manned aircraft crews do not. I watch the post-strike assessment. I know exactly what happened. I carry exactly what happened. That is not the absence of courage. It is a different address for the same requirement. My uncle had not thought about it that way. He had been thinking about it in terms of physical presence and physical risk, which is a reasonable framework for someone whose military experience was built entirely around physical presence in dangerous environments. He had not spent time thinking about what the decision to employ a weapon from a ground control station in Nevada required of the person making it. He had not imagined the sensor picture, the clarity of the imagery, the specific weight of watching the effect of your own decision through a high-definition camera from 14,000 feet. When I told him, on that Tuesday afternoon at his kitchen table, he listened to the sensor picture description with the specific attention of a person who is revising a model. He asked questions, not defensive questions, genuine ones. "What does it look like?" he asked. "The thermal picture when a vehicle is hit," I told him, precisely and honestly, without softening, because he had asked a direct question and deserved a direct answer. He was quiet for a while afterward. Then he said, "That's harder than I thought." "Yes," I said. "Most things are harder than they look from the outside." That applies to what I said about you. It does. He looked at me. "I'm sorry." He said it without ceremony, in the same direct way he said everything, which meant it was genuine. I noted it. Not the apology itself, though the apology mattered. The fact that he had arrived at it through understanding rather than obligation. He understood what I had been doing and what it required, and he had revised his framework because the evidence was not consistent with what the framework had predicted, which is the correct response to evidence. That is the kind of apology worth having. Let me describe the pattern of a typical high-value surveillance mission, because the Convoy overwatch missions like April 22nd are one type of RPA operation, and the surveillance to strike missions are another, and they require different skills and different kinds of sustained attention, and the second type is what my uncle imagined when he thought about what I did in the least accurate way. A high-value target surveillance mission begins not in the ground control station, but in the intelligence product that identifies the target and builds the pattern of life assessment that will ultimately support a targeting decision. I contribute to that intelligence product in my role as the crew member who has spent hours watching the target compound. I observe. I track. I record what I see in mission logs that go into the intelligence database and contribute to an analytical picture built by analysts I will never meet in a building I will never visit. My sensor observations become data points in someone else's synthesis. My synthesis of what I'm watching becomes input to someone else's decision. I am one node in a network that has layers of expertise and accountability above me and below me and beside me. And my specific node is the one that happens to be closest to the aircraft and therefore to the target, which is why my sensor reads matter, and why my crew resource management with web matters, and why the 47 minutes of surveillance before the mortar fire mattered. I am not autonomous. I operate within a system that is designed to prevent single-point failures by distributing accountability across multiple decision-makers. The weapons release that ended the mortar threat on April 22nd required my positive identification, my collateral damage assessment, my authorization request, my BattleWatch controller's authorization, and my weapons release. 5 decision points across 2 people before the missile left the wing. That is not a video game. That is a carefully designed accountability structure that the military has built specifically because the consequences of errors are permanent, and the margin for those errors must be as narrow as the technology can make it. My uncle had not imagined any of this. His framework for what I did had no room for it. It had room for a person with a controller, watching a screen, pressing a button. The reality had room for years of training, a crew of 2 with complementary skills, a multi-layered authorization process, and a set of decisions made in 41 seconds that had been prepared for by hundreds of hours of the specific kind of practice that makes 41 seconds of decision-making reliable. There is one more thing I want to say about the convoy, about April 22nd specifically, before I close this account. I have not told my uncle that I watched his convoy for 47 minutes and that for 12 of those minutes, from the time Webb identified movement on the ridgeline to the time the first mortar round fired, I was watching a thermal picture that might have been the last picture I watched that shift with his convoy alive. 12 minutes of surveillance that I now understand, in retrospect, as 12 minutes of watching my uncle's situation and understanding it with a resolution he will never experience from inside it. He was in the 3rd vehicle. I know because I know the convoy configuration, and I know which vehicle is the 3rd one, and I know what a thermal signature looks like from inside an armored vehicle moving at patrol speed. I watched his vehicle for 47 minutes, and I didn't know it was his vehicle until the after-action confirmed the call sign. I watched it the way I watched every vehicle on every convoy, with the complete professional attention that the mission required, with the specific surveillance that builds the picture that allows the engagement to be precise. And when the mortar team fired, the professional response I had trained for 2 years to execute was already in motion before the personal recognition could arrive, which is how it should work, and how I am glad it worked, because the personal recognition arriving first would have been a complication the mission could not afford. The work protected him. The work was doing its job before I even knew who I was protecting. That is also what is in the notebook. All of it. The 47 minutes and the 12 decisions and the 41 seconds and the 4 months between the mission and the Thanksgiving, where he called drone pilots cowards, and the Tuesday afternoon conversation and the cousin in the pipeline. All of it in the same handwriting. All of it part of the same record. Write it down. Every mission, every decision, every time someone tells you the work doesn't count. It counts. It counted for 12 vehicles in Helmand Province on April 22nd. It will count again. Keep writing. Keep. The Thanksgiving after the Tuesday conversation was different, in the specific way that things are different when a significant understanding has passed between 2 people, and both of them know it, and neither of them is performing about it. My uncle was quieter than usual at dinner. Not cold, not awkward, just quieter. He asked me questions about my current assignment, real ones with follow-up questions that indicated he was actually listening rather than waiting for the answer to be over. He asked about Webb, whose name I had mentioned in the Tuesday conversation. He asked about the qualification pipeline, whether it was changing, whether the Air Force was thinking differently about how it structured RPA training. These were the questions of a person who had updated his model and was now collecting data to refine it. I answered them the same way I answered everything, directly and completely, with the specifics that made the answers real rather than general. My mother watched this from across the table with the expression of a person who has been watching 2 people misunderstand each other for years and is now watching something different happen and is not quite ready to trust that the change is permanent. I caught her eye once. She raised her eyebrows slightly. I gave her the small nod that meant, yes, this is real. After dinner, my uncle found me in the kitchen while I was doing dishes. He stood beside me for a moment without saying anything. Then, I told your cousin's commanding officer, the recruiter, that you were a good model for what the pipeline produces, that he should let the candidates talk to you before they commit. I looked at him. Did you clear that with me first? No, I should have. I don't mind, I said. I just want to know. I'm trying to make it right, he said. I know, I said. That's why I drove to your house on a Tuesday. He nodded once. We finished the dishes. The record continued. It is still continuing. I am still writing it down. Something I did not include in the Tuesday conversation, because it was not the right time for it, is the number of times I have thought about what the conversation would look like from my uncle's side if the positions were reversed. If he had spent 20 years doing work that required physical courage in visible, dangerous environments, and I had spent 3 years telling him that physical courage was overrated and that his proximity to the danger was a historical artifact of a less technologically sophisticated era, he would have been right to find that dismissive and wrong. The argument I am making is not that physical courage doesn't matter, or that the infantry soldier's experience of combat is not genuinely different from the RPA pilot's experience. It is that different is not lesser. It is that the courage framework applies differently to different roles, and that applying the wrong framework produces the wrong evaluation. My uncle's courage was real, and I never doubted it. I needed him to extend the same logic to mine, which required him to first understand what my work actually involved, which required the kind of conversation we had in August, and the follow-up conversations that continued after it. Understanding changes frameworks. Frameworks change what we see when we look at the people around us. Changing what we see changes what we say at Thanksgiving. The chain runs from the correct information, to the correct assessment, to the correct words, and the only way to start that chain is to provide the correct information to the person who needs it, directly, on a Tuesday afternoon, without an audience, when the time is right. The time is always eventually right. You just have to be patient enough to wait for it and ready enough to use it when it comes. I was both. The record I kept made me both. Write it down. Keep writing it down. It is always worth it. Every mission, every comment, every Tuesday afternoon that the record made possible, all of it worth keeping, all of it worth the patience it took to wait.